Hey everyone, welcome back to Engelbart Gaming. Today I've got another hardware review for you. This time I'll be taking a look at the new MagicX Zero 40. What a name. Yes, I know you've probably seen reviews on it already, but I'll try and give you something a little different here so that it's still worth watching. And I can tell you, my opinion on this device isn't the same as most of what I'm seeing out there, so stick around and find out why. First up, the disclosure. I bought this system with my own money, and I am not beholden to anyone for this review. So everything you're going to see in here is my own unvarnished opinion. No one approved anything about this review in advance, or had any input on the script. Alright, with that out of the way, let's get on with it. There are a lot of emulation handhelds out there these days. You might think you've seen everything, there's absolutely no reason to even consider buying yet another one. If you think that, well, you're wrong! As I've said in a few other recent hardware reviews, the handheld emulation scene these days is all about differentiation and specialization. What does a new device bring to the table that makes it unique from other devices that have come before it? We've seen a few answers to that from companies like Retroid, Ambernic, and Powkitty recently. We've seen some new clamshell handhelds, some that mimic classic systems like the GBA or GBA-SP, some that have square aspect ratio screens, some with Sega Genesis style 6 action button layouts, and more. MagicX's, or technically Ampown's, latest device here, the MagicX Zero 40, is a unique, purpose-built device. It's designed to be a good way to play Nintendo DS games, as well as vertically oriented arcade games. So I'll tell you up front, if those aren't things that you want in a handheld emulation device, you probably don't want to consider the Zero 40. However, if a convenient way to play DS or tate mode arcade games sounds spiffy to you, then stick with me while I go into the details of the device. The Zero 40, first and foremost, is a tiny device, probably smaller than you were expecting if you've only ever seen pictures of it by itself. The star of the show here is the 4-inch vertically oriented touch display, making this device look like a tiny smartphone with controls bolted onto each of its sides. The system is relatively thin and fairly comfortable. It might even put some in mind of the first model of the Nintendo 2DS, even though it's far from a clone of that device. The vertical screen in the center of the unit has a 480 by 800 display, and sure, that resolution is a smidge low, but with a screen this size and for the games most people would want to play on the Zero 40, it's mostly fine, with a few caveats that we'll talk about shortly. As far as the controls go, we have a D-pad, a single analog stick with click functionality, 4 face buttons, start, select, a dual back and home button, 2 sets of shoulder buttons, a power button on the right side, and a volume rocker on the left side. In addition to that, the Zero 40 has front-facing stereo speakers, 2 micro SD card slots on the right side, as is common on devices like this one these days, and on top of the unit we have a headphone jack, a USB-C OTG port, and a USB-C charging port. The only accessory in the box is a lone USB-C to USB-A cable, as has become the norm in modern times. There's no AC adapter in the box. The Zero 40 is currently available in white or black as of this recording, but there are rumblings that other colors might emerge down the road. Now I have to say, I really like the design of the device. It's thin and smooth and curvy, and it just looks like something I'd expect from an actual gaming device manufacturer based on the aesthetics alone. So for visual appeal, I give this one a big thumbs up. Now let's finish this section up with a look at how the Zero 40 compares size-wise to a bunch of recent Ambernic systems, all of which have been reviewed here on the channel. I'll let the pictures do the talking here. Alright, let's discuss the specs a bit. The MagicX Zero 40 uses an all-winner Cortex A53 with a PowerVR GPU and 2GB of RAM. Technically the device runs Android 10, but by default it's sort of locked behind the front-end DOM, and you won't have full access to the Google Play Store or any of the usual Android trappings you might be used to. So as far as raw power goes, this is definitely an entry-level device. Let's talk about what the Zero 40 is made for next. For DS emulation, it includes the Drastic emulator as well as Melon DS. Drastic is a great emulator that performs well even on low-spec machines, and every DS game I tried on it ran fine. Having said that, Drastic definitely isn't perfect, and you might encounter some games that have minor glitches, or the occasional game that's unplayable. But for the vast majority of the library, Drastic is perfectly okay. Melon DS, on the other hand, requires more raw CPU power, so don't expect games to be full speed when trying to run them via Melon DS. There's really no reason to use it on the Zero 40, and I'm kind of surprised it's here at all. If you haven't played on a real DS in a while, it's actually pleasant to play most of these games with a dual screen setup as intended. Of course, your mileage will vary depending on the game you're playing. Some games didn't use the second screen at all, but most utilized it in some way, and it was often most useful for showing maps and stuff in the Castlevania games, Final Fantasy IV, and a whole bunch of others. By default, Drastic is configured to render 3D games at double their normal resolution, which is why these games might look a tad smoother than you remember. I left that setting on because I wanted to show you what you can expect as an out-of-the-box experience with this device. Normally I'd turn off any enhancements like this in reviews, but I left it on because it's subtle and it's fine. Now you can easily configure Drastic to remove this setting if you want to turn it off. Now I did turn off the FPS display because that was just getting in the way of important in-game information. Now one weird note I'll add here before moving on is that a software update became available for the 040 about 5 days after I got the device, and performance is worse after the update. I had to go into the emulator's settings and tweak some things to get them running at or near full speed again. So I'm hoping whatever they did in this update they can undo in the next update. I'll keep you posted if there's any changes by posting a sticky comment here. I will also point out, however, that you do get control over the CPU governor, which can change how much power gets devoted to the CPU, usually at the expense of battery life. I set it to maximum performance after the update, and it didn't fix the stuttering issue that the update introduced. Moving right along, if you're wondering about 3DS emulation on this device, well, don't. It's a higher spec system with a much different display, and it's not in the realm of the 040's capabilities. Now let's talk about vertical or tate mode arcade games. Pretty much everything I tested also ran at full speed without issue, at least before the update. I had to tweak settings after the update to fix whatever they messed up. Arcade games run via RetroArch and will have a default emulation core selected, but you can update the settings for each individual game to decide which core the game will run with it. If you're new to arcade emulation, just be aware that some games run fine in older versions of MAME, but not newer versions and vice versa. Same for Final Burn. You might have to experiment to find which core runs the game you want to play the best. Something else I'll note here is that most of these vertical arcade games were designed for a 3:4 aspect ratio, but the 040 has a 3:5 aspect ratio. This means that below the screen you'll either see an overlay or a blank space. Now an overlay is enabled by default, and while I did want to show you everything with default settings like I mentioned a little bit ago, I passionately hated the overlay and had to remove it for my own sanity. Now plenty of classics and vertical shooters feel great on the 040, even with the blank space at the bottom of the screen. It's nice seeing classics that utilize most of the screen and don't have a stretched or distorted look. Occasionally you'll probably run into games that used weirdo resolutions, so it'll still be possible to encounter shimmering and some artifacts like that, but for the most part old vertical arcade games look really nice on here. Another system that's pretty decent on the 040 that I haven't seen anyone else talk about, probably because it's very obscure, is the Vectrex. Now in case you just heard that and you're thinking to yourself, Vec what? Allow me to explain. The Vectrex is an old vector-based game system from the early 1980s that came with a vertically oriented monitor. I will note Vectrex is not supported right out of the box. You have to go into RetroArch and manually download the Vectrex core if you want to use it. So Vectrex fans, here you go, here's a look at performance on this system. Just note that not every game runs on here, particularly newer homebrew games. But for the ones that work, we get to play them on a screen with proportions much more similar to the real system than on other handhelds. So that about does it for vertically oriented games and systems. What should we look at next? Let's talk about systems with other aspect ratios, ones that are not designed with a vertical orientation in mind. For devices with more square aspect ratio screens like the Game Boy and Neo Geo Pocket Color, they're not too bad on here. You'll have a lot of empty black space below them with the standard aspect ratios they use, but it's easy to focus on just the active part of the screen. Game Boy is actually pretty pleasant on here and it looks great. I'll show you just a few games on that and then we'll move on. Here's Sonic Pocket Adventure on the Neo Geo Pocket Color. Much like the Game Boy, the Neo Geo Pocket Color has a more square-like aspect ratio for its screen. Also like the Game Boy, it looks similarly good on the 040 in my opinion, and it works pretty well. But let's move on to something that will really challenge this display format. For 4x3 systems like the Genesis, SNES, and PlayStation, well, you've got two main options. Option 1 is you can play them in the tiny portion they take up at the top part of the tall screen. Now you can mitigate this slightly by changing the aspect ratio a bit in RetroArch for minor stretching that some will consider acceptable, while others may not. Option 2 is you can set these systems to rotate either 90 or 270 degrees and flip the 040 around either 270 or 90 degrees and set the controls up however you like. Now as you can see, Altered Beast on the Genesis here is itty bitty when playing in the standard orientation. It's not a good experience. However, if I set the rotation to 270 degrees in RetroArch and spin the 040 accordingly, suddenly, hey, this isn't too bad. It's not even that awkward to hold. I didn't even adjust the controls here, but I could to make this an even better experience. I wouldn't want to play intense action games this way, but for slower paced stuff, it's totally fine. I also could have reconfigured the analog stick directions to work like buttons, but decided I didn't feel like it. So that's 4x3 systems. What about something 16x9 like the PSP? There's enough horsepower inside the 040 to run some PSP games at full speed. In the portrait mode orientation, the screen is tiny and unusable in my opinion. Flip it either 90 or 270 degrees, and there you go, much better. And when rotating the display through the PPSSPP menu, it actually automatically adjusts the directional controls, so you don't even have to configure anything else. Now I'll repeat that this rotation angle isn't ideal for fast action games or anything that requires a lot of button pressing, but for puzzle games, RPGs, or anything slower, it's definitely doable. Let's go back to the screen for a moment here. Now 4 inches might sound like an adequate screen size on paper, but it's pretty tiny when you see games actually running on it. Now I'm using a Pixel 6a as my primary phone these days, and the screen on the 040 is just slightly over half the size of the Pixel 6a screen. Text will be hard to read in some games, items will be hard to see in others. Still others that require touch control will work fine, but good luck with precision touch input on that itty bitty screen. The display is much smaller than any version of the DS Nintendo put out, and you might want to invest in a small tipped capacitive stylus if you plan to play a lot of touch input games. In some ways, it's kind of like this is a DS Micro. The battery life was in line with, or actually exceeded expectations. Playing a mix of DS and arcade titles, I did indeed get about 6 or 7 hours on average during my testing of the 040. Surprisingly, I got even longer than that on a few occasions, over 8 hours and closer to 9 once or twice. The screen is pretty bright even at low percentages like 30, so if you're indoors, keeping the brightness low will help extend that battery life even more. Now, sound quality from the built-in speakers was okay, but not great. It's about average for devices in this price range, but at least they were good enough to include front-firing stereo speakers. I don't have any serious complaints about the sound quality for the price range this device is within. Yeah, it's slightly lacking bass, and some might find it just a twinge tinny, but I think most people will be totally fine with it. Now what about those controls? Now the D-pad and face buttons are all a bit on the mushy side. When I first fired this thing up, the D-pad wasn't all that responsive, and I was getting accidental diagonals all over the place. That seemed to settle a bit after a while, but that wasn't the end of my D-pad woes. I have to say the D-pad is worse than I expected. Mine tends to lean downward, for lack of a better term, which can cause a character to duck while walking straight in some games, which is incredibly annoying. It's just not balanced right, and it makes some games very tough to play. I'd say the ABXY face buttons are even worse. If you touch them in the wrong spot, they won't smoothly press down, and they could scrape along the edges of the buttonholes, making a bit of a jarring, loud noise. For me, that's just unacceptable in hardware you're selling to the public. Now, it wasn't constant, but it happened many times during about my week of testing. Now, the analog stick is just okay. It feels similar to the analog stick on the original Nintendo Switch Joy-Con. It works well enough and it feels better than the D-pad, and I often use it instead of the D-pad while playing games on the system. It's pretty handy for that if nothing else. Remember, the systems the 040 handles best don't support analog control, so there's no reason to not just duplicate the D-pad controls on it. Personally, I'm also not a huge fan of front-facing power and status lights. The one on the 040 is in the front left corner and it's pretty large. Now it's dimmer than most, making it easier to ignore than some bright lights I've seen on other devices, but it can still be distracting at times. I'd much rather have had this on the top of the unit next to the charging port and also smaller. Finally, I have to talk about another issue that is very important these days. When you buy this device from MagicX directly, it comes with an SD card full of copyrighted game ROMs. You have no option to buy the device without it. Now, local laws wherever you live could result in you getting in trouble just for purchasing this device. Companies like MagicX and Ambernic really need to just stop including copyrighted ROMs already. Those of you following a certain Italian YouTuber situation will understand why they need to stop. These companies should all offer a version with no ROMs and only the operating system. That's how every one of these devices should be sold. In a related note, and as far as extras are concerned, MagicX has a few different firmware images that they've made available for the 040. You can download a firmware that includes a native version of Android with no game ROMs. If you want to take the 040 legit, that's the way to do it. If you decide to go that route, you'll have to put all your own game ROMs onto a micro SD card. And ordinarily, I'd give you a link to the site that has that firmware on it, but I'm not going to do it this time. Why not? Because they also have the firmware images in the same place that include game ROMs, and I'm not linking to any pages with ROMs on them. Hopefully we're approaching the day that these companies realize what a problem this is and quit it. I imagine companies like Nintendo won't allow them to just do this unchallenged forever. Some device manufacturers already just ship their standard devices with no game ROMs, and it's often the higher end ones from companies like AYN. They're doing it right. Anyway, as far as other extras go, the Zero 40 has both Wi-Fi and Bluetooth capabilities. The Wi-Fi is especially handy if you're including your own ROMs, but want to use a scraper to collect artwork for them, or to add new cores to RetroArch, or even update existing ones. Alright, so it's time to take stock exactly of what we have here in the MagicX Zero 40. As I mentioned, the device is small. Most people will probably find it a little too small. If you're getting on in years like me or most of this device's target audience, you are likely to have a hard time seeing some things or reading text in some games on this screen, and you might find it a bit of a strain. I know I did. As far as the overall design of the system, I think it looks really nice. I would have appreciated if it were a tad more ergonomic, but on the plus side, because it's flat, it makes rotating it to play games in landscape mode less of a hassle than it would otherwise have been. The screen quality itself is fine. It's a bit low res these days, but more than adequate for the games people will mostly want to play on it. The controls are hit and miss, the below average D-pad, bad face buttons, and basically fine everything else. I've seen complaints about the shoulder buttons, but I didn't have any issues with mine. Now I seriously question how long the face buttons on my device are going to last because of that scraping issue that I mentioned earlier. While those are some serious issues that affect the experience you'll have with the Zero 40, even with these fairly serious flaws, I have to say I love the idea of a device like the Zero 40. Had it shipped with a 5-inch screen, slightly better D-pad, and slightly better face buttons, this thing would have been great, and I would have happily given the device a high score, most likely an 8 out of 10. As it stands, the button issue hurts it a lot, the screen size issue hurts it just a little. The experience provided by the Zero 40 is still decent for a lot of DS and vertically oriented arcade games. You can do things like enabling auto-fire in arcade titles to remedy the button issue, but you shouldn't have to employ workarounds because of substandard parts and design. As far as price goes, I think the $75 asking price is a smidge high for the hardware that powers the device and the clearly not premium components within it. If we're talking about what price will be fair for this device as it stands, I think $60 or just below that would have been reasonable. When all is said and done, I'm giving the MagicX Zero 40 a 6 out of 10. I think a revision or sequel device could easily fix the problems of the Zero 40 and instantly become the go-to device for vertical or portrait mode gaming. It really is a great idea where the execution just needed a little more work. But for the device we got, it's the only dedicated handheld around right now for vertically oriented games, and if you want it mostly for slower paced stuff like RPGs, you'll probably still really enjoy it. If you stray beyond that to games that require a lot of fast button presses, well, that's when the woes of the system will become very apparent. So there you go, that's my review of the MagicX Zero 40. I'd really been hoping someone would release a vertical handheld like this for years now. I'm glad this one exists, and hopefully it'll show that there's enough interest in these kinds of devices to iterate on them and make them better. Maybe next time MagicX or Ambernick or Retroid or someone else will develop one that's an absolute home run. In the meantime, it's possible to get some enjoyment out of this one if you can deal with a bit of frustration. So tell me, what did you guys think? Do you have a MagicX Zero 40? Were you thinking about getting one? Did this review help you make your final decision one way or the other? Tell me all about it in the comments. That'll do it for this video, my retro gaming friends. If you enjoyed the video, please like and share it online somewhere. If you haven't yet, please subscribe to my channel and hit the notification bell so you won't miss any of my videos. If you want to support the work that I do here, you can do that on Patreon, Ko-fi, or right here on YouTube through things like super thanks and channel memberships. And this review was made possible thanks to your support. With that, I'll say thanks for watching, and see me later.